Good morning if you are in Berkeley, California. Good high noon if you're in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Good afternoon if you're in New York City or Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Good evening if you're in Oslo, Norway or Riga, Latvia. And good morning to our friends in Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and all over Japan. Welcome to a really very special edition of Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Idagio, the place where classical music happens. Idagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all over the world where we have an audience. And my guest today is someone I call him a friend. I don't see him very often because he is all over the world, including all the places I just mentioned and many more. And he's very special. I'll just put it as that. And we met in unusual circumstances through the arts. And what I've done today for the first time in the 4 years of this program is actually have written an introduction rather than going freestyle, because my guest is, by the way, Seth Shelden. We met on June 10th, 2016, when I was invited by my friend Kathy Beal to a performance at the New York Fringe Festival to attend the modern reconstruction of an early show by the Marx Brothers called I'll Say She Is, or I'll Say She Is. Seth will tell me how to pronounce it. This show opened on Broadway on May 19th, 1924, and ran for 313 performances and then largely vanished as the Marx Brothers went on to even greater fame with The Coconuts in 1925, which became a film in 1929. Seth played the role that was assumed on Broadway by Harpo Marx. Therefore, he was highly musical and comedic, but also silent. He was incredibly funny and athletic. At one performance later on, he suffered an injury, perhaps an Achilles tendon, I don't recall. We had been scheduled to get together socially, but his injury sidelined him, and I did not get to know him or the fact that this gifted actor and musician had a whole other life as an impassioned lawyer who would the next year be part of an organization that won the Nobel Prize for Peace, which from Harvard to Marx to the Nobel Peace Prize in a year is phenomenal. So before we get into the Nobel Peace Prize, I want to talk more about you as a performing artist. Your bio in BroadwayWorld.com says Seth Shelden is a native of Brooklyn, New York, and an award-winning actor who has appeared in numerous theatrical productions, films, commercials, and music videos. He's a member of the Screen Actors Guild, and the Indie Theater Hall of Fame inducted him in 2014 as the Indie Theater as an Independent Person of the Year. And he's a founding member of the Ground Up Productions, not as in ground beef, I think, but from the ground up. And I did my research, and normally I have a couple of pages on people. Seth, I have a dossier practically, but I'm not using it. I read it, and now I'm just going to my notes. You play numerous musical instruments: oboe, saxophone, alto, tenor, soprano, piano, harp, as one would expect, because you play Harpo Marx, clarinet, flute, English horn, melodica, cue chord, trumpet, and accordion. You've appeared in films. You have a whole career in the arts, which is where I met you and how I met you. And yet you also have a law degree. You studied international relations. You are a practicing attorney specializing in international contract law, you'll tell me. And in addition, you are passionately committed to something that I care deeply about, which is to say nuclear disarmament, and something that I've worked in and strove for a very, very, very long time, really since I'm a kid. You are a teacher. You are a visual artist. In your in your spare time, competitive swimming, soccer, water polo, basketball, rock climbing, juggling, which I've seen you do. Language and dialects, some Spanish, German, Latvian, Estonian, Hebrew, British, American, European accents and dialects. You've been to 54 continents, countries on 6 continents. You've lived on 3 continents. You are an attorney, a professor, a lifeguard, an emergency medical technician, and a profession I don't know, a coin snatcher. What is a coin snatcher?
That's the first thing you want me to respond to?
Yeah, I know everything else.
Um, I'll tell you. First of all, though, this is thank you, Fred. I've just learned so much about myself. I think I should update a few of those facts. I don't know where some of them. I mean, I learned just now that I have a bio on Broadway World, but it's really great to be with you, and it's always fun to be with you, but just really fun to be in conversation with my favorite rock on tour. Um, and so thank you for that overwhelming introduction. A coin snatching is when you balance coins on your arm, on your elbow, and you grab them. And when I was a kid, my friends and I were really bored, and we learned to become very good at it. And yeah.
So we're going to get into a lot of the stuff that you do and have done. I know because you told me that you were very close to your late father, who was a musician, and a lot of your formation that way, and perhaps your worldview came from him. Do you want to tell me about him and what he did? His name was Paul.
Yes. Yeah, Paul Sheldon. He passed from COVID at the very beginning of the pandemic. But he was both my father and a close collaborator in a lot of the creative works that I did. And I think we collaborated with his late life project to make musical instruments. But before that, he was quite an influential woodwind performer and educator. He was a assistant director at the Conservatory of Music at Brooklyn College and professor there. But he had really, I'd like to think, like myself, actually, it was something of a multi-hyphenate at least in that space. Because in the sense that he had his classical degrees from Juilliard, and he played under Leonard Bernstein and played in a wide range of classical related genres, but also then started doing some of the less classy things, like he was like the youngest band director, I think they called it, band leader, band director in the Catskills when he was there as a kid. And
Mhm.
uh, he had just come straight off this. He has a twin brother, and the two of them, when they were kids, performed and got some recognition, I guess, when they performed on the Ted Mack Original Amateur Hour.
Mhm.
Uh, and then he had his Catskills career after that. But later on, he played Carnegie Hall and the Kennedy Center, but also Broadway pits and recording studios. So yeah, that was his life.
But
And
I do want to interrupt for a second because I have an international audience. Not everybody knows what the Catskills means when you say that. These are some mountains north of New York City, sometimes called the Jewish Alps. They were a place that had resort hotels that had comedians, people like Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks would work as waiters. And Mel Brooks was what was known as a tumler, someone to sort of get the audience animated and laughing and feeling Freylock in a good mood. And Jewish families, sort of in the 1940s, early 1950s, would go there for their vacation from New York City, which was very hot. There was no air conditioning. And they would go and eat and talk and do matchmaking and try to introduce their son to someone else's daughter. And it was an entire social world. It was not a religious world particularly, although there were a couple of places that maybe observed kosher rules, but it
Hmm.
was more secular, liberal, progressive, Yiddishkeit Judaica, where it was about preserving a culture, especially because World War II had just happened and the Holocaust had just happened. And while they wouldn't necessarily be talking about that all the time, there was an awareness that the people would say, we're here by the grace of God. If we believe in God, we're lucky. Let's build a better world, whatever that meant. And I didn't spend too much time in the Catskills, only once really, but I had relatives who did. And the sense of building a better world, of making amends, of creating something for our children that's better than what we had and what those poor people in the Holocaust, Jewish or non-Jewish, who were murdered by the Nazis or who died in war in other ways. Um, there was an awareness of that. And I grew up in that world, but not in, I didn't go to the Catskills really, but with this awareness in Brooklyn and in Manhattan, where I was, that whether it's civil rights, whether it's women's rights, later gay rights, other rights, whatever movements that could be created to make the playing field more level, more egalitarian, more fair, more inclusive. That was part of the spirit of the Catskills, even as they were shoveling down more chopped liver than anyone should ever eat. So,
That's a brilliant, I think, description of what it was for so many people. It was sort of that life and culture was a bit before my time even, so I didn't grow up going there. And For a lot of people, if they don't have the benefit of your very thorough description, I sometimes just use the shorthand of like a Jewish Vegas almost, or Vegas, or Dirty Dancing for people of a
yep.
certain era. Just that's a cultural reference point. The movie Dirty Dancing, which was quite close to my parents' lives in some ways, I feel like, because they met there.
Mm-hmm.
They met when my father was the band director at the Stevensville Resort, and my mother was a singer there. Um, so yeah, I mean, but I think nowadays this that region is doesn't really function as it did in that way. I don't think anymore. And sort of
Because of air conditioning and cheap airline travel, that
yeah,
people don't have to go for 2 weeks in the mountains. They can go to 2 weeks at a beach wherever they want to go,
yeah,
and or live in air conditioning or a fan at least in their homes in New York City or wherever.
yeah. And
Our
perhaps
stories
some
are a
of
bit
the
similar.
exposure,
Yeah.
I was just saying, perhaps some of the also rules that kept even wealthy Jewish people out of the clubs that they might otherwise go to in other
Yeah.
parts of the country. I think, still had a legacy even, probably into the 70s, and and perhaps beyond, the places where legally they were allowed to have membership, but culturally they weren't accepted. So, this was an alternative.
I can certainly remember seeing signs that said in New York State and in Pennsylvania, no blacks, Jews, or dogs allowed. And of course, the dogs can't read that.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about my Marx Brothers history, and of course, the famous story of Groucho Marx, who's was denied entry to some club. Hopefully I get this right, but I mean, some club, I think, in LA, and he then writes a letter back and asks, "Well, how about my daughter? She's only half Jewish. Can she go up to her waist?" Oh, it was about the pool. Sorry, I said that up wrong. That he couldn't go in the pool, and said, "My daughter's half Jewish. Can she go in up to her waist?"
Was it Groucho who said I wouldn't belong to any club that would have me as a member?
Yeah. Well, that one, yeah, yes, I think that one's true. It's certainly
Yeah,
accredited to him. There's a lot of, like Mark Twain, there's a bunch of things that are accredited to him that we're not so sure he
true.
said, but that's one. Yeah.
So, serious question. I'm trying to picture your living room or bedroom in Brooklyn when you were a little boy. And did you have a playpen and what was around you? Was there music around? Were there books? How, how did you begin your development?
Yeah, music and books. I mean, that's like if I had to think of avatars for my parents, those it would be essentially music notes and books because
Hmm.
my father, as I described, was had this long career in music, and my mother and went on to get her PhD in. My father also got his doctorate in music, but my mother got a doctorate in literature. So, music and books, that indeed was sort of what surrounded my sister and I growing up. But but I wouldn't say that anything was well forced upon me in any more than um, the average parent would. Like I don't feel like I had quite the same pressures, and so I was really interested in other things as a kid, like sports and history, and I just sort of I didn't find the most direct path to the things that I do today.
And because we're New York based, I know you went to University of North Carolina and Berkeley and all that. Where did you go to junior high school and high school? And this is like Brooklyn geography, and
Yeah.
Barbara Streisand went here and Woody Allen went there.
Yeah, you're really starting me from the beginning. Yeah, okay. So
Yes.
I grew up in Canarsie, which is
Okay.
the eastern part of Brooklyn. Most people don't go there. If you maybe you're taking the L train from Manhattan to Williamsburg, and if you like fall asleep on the train, maybe you'll end up in Canarsie, and then you should probably turn around. But when I was growing up, it was a very Jewish and Italian kind of neighborhood. It's near where kind of like another movie reference, like Goodfellas, is set in East New York. It's like it had a very kind of mafia kind of
Hmm.
relationship, parts of it too. So I went to public elementary school there, PS 279. And then I went to junior high school at a magnet school, another public school, the Mark Twain in Coney Island.
Hmm.
Uh, where I think it still functions this way there, that you like get in on a talent, um, and then you spend like, half of the week just doing that talent. It could be like science or creative writing or, whatever. They had like all these different, sort of curricula for your talent, as it were. And mine was, visual art. I was doing, which was actually my first love, just a lot of painting and sculpting and drawing and such. Then I went to Midwood High School, which is
Woody Allen.
Flatbush. Did
Yep,
Woody Allen went there? I didn't know
I
that.
believe so.
I only went there for 1 year,
Yep.
actually.
And
I
Senator Charles Schumer, I think.
wow.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg grew up near there. My mother grew up right there. Yep.
So far this whole session, I've learned more about myself from you than I have from myself. Um, I didn't know that, but I wasn't there very long. In my defense, I didn't want to go to Stuyvesant at first because my mother taught at Stuyvesant High School.
Mhm.
So, but after a year at Midwood, I did want to go. So I transferred in my sophomore year to Stuyvesant High School, which at the time was in the East Village or on 15th Street, really, and First Avenue. Um, and
And was
then
it still all boys when you went there, or was it
you know,
co-ed?
it wasn't all boys since, I don't know, the 60s or something, I think.
Okay. More
Uh,
like the 70s, because when I went to high school, I didn't apply to Stuyvesant because it was all boy.
yeah, that's good reasoning, I think. And
And
yeah, it was founded in 1904, I
yep.
believe, as a boys' school. But um, so I wasn't there for that transition. However, I was there for the transition of the edifices from when
Hmm.
in my junior year we moved to the what we called the new building, which isn't so new
Yep.
anymore, on Chambers Street in Battery Park. Back when Battery Park was, more landfill than it is today, where
Yep.
all the high places are. And of course, before 9/11, although while I was there, we had I think it was in 1996, the first the bombing inside
February
the
26, 1993
oh oh I'm sorry, yeah, I had my
was the first bombing. Yeah.
first of all, that's you remember the day. It's impressive. But yes, you're right. I had my junior year mixed up from college and high school,
Yeah.
1993. Yeah. So I was there for that day. And my mother was there
Mm,
uh, for for September 11th, 2001.
wow.
Um, with my sister was at Pace at that time, which was also in downtown. So they were both nearby. But then, and then, yeah, as you say, I went to North Carolina for college.
I'm going to stop you while we're still in New York City because listeners not from New York City may not know something about our city that certainly other places name schools for famous figures. That's not unique to here. But there's something about the naming of junior high schools, now called middle schools, in New York City, that whenever I meet someone who went to a named school, they became fascinated by the person for whom the school was named. So you went to Mark Twain Junior High. I went to Joan of Arc Junior High. And for me, Joan of Arc became a very important symbol of resistance, of defying authority to do the right thing. And at that time, it was something of an experimental school, and it had a black female principal at a time when that was not usual. And she was a leading educator and was actually removed from the school and put in charge of a whole system at the Board of Education. And the replacement principal was not quite as good as Dr. Gaines was. And so I created a newspaper called the JOA, Joan of Arc Journal, that was about crusading reporting covering the issues of the school. But
Hmm.
the word really was crusading and understanding what Joan of Arc would be willing to sacrifice in pursuit of her beliefs.
Hmm.
And it's very influential. When I have met other people who went to other schools with other names, they tended to be fascinated by their namesake. So you went to Mark Twain.
That's true, I suppose I might have inhabited that pattern, except I would also say that who wouldn't be fascinated by Mark Twain?
Mm-hmm.
So that's that's an easy one, and perhaps my interest in Mark Twain started before I went to junior high school, and maybe had not little to do with where I went to junior high school. Um, and although, yeah, because I don't recall a moment where our namesake had any sort of relationship to the curriculum or anything like that. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so I was interested.
Well,
Uh,
Joan of Arc did not either. I pursued her on my own
yeah.
because I wanted to know who this was about, and therefore became interested in all works of music about
Mm,
Joan of Arc, of which there are many. There are operas and oratorios, and Honegger did this wonderful piece in which Joan of Arc at the stake, in which an actress such as Martha Keller will recite in French or in German the story, the drama of Joan of Arc. To me, even the whole thing about the flames surrounding her as she burned at the stake and what that could be like was very operatic for me.
mm,
And my sense of what could you do on an opera stage came from that. As it happened, the actress that I fell in love with first, as almost every boy might or girl, was Ingrid Bergman, even before I knew that she famously played Joan of Arc. So that these things that in childhood that we notice and acknowledge somehow keep recurring for us in life in different ways. And I am certain that things happen for you that you absorbed and took in musically, artistically, visually, artistically, that you live with today and that have become recurrent themes. We don't have to explore that now, but I know that I feel that in you is all I can say about that.
oh, no, I'm sure that's true. I mean, I'm not sure to what extent it was Mark Twain, but I do agree,
Right.
certainly. All of these elements, they inhabit who we are in ways that on a daily basis we're totally unaware of. And when they call them formative years,
Yeah.
it's for a reason, and sometimes a reason that those of us not expert in psychology don't even appreciate.
Right. In fact, that meant that I didn't think it was Mark Twain for you. I'm sure there are many others, um, musical heroes, visual arts heroes,
Yeah.
and many others. Um, at what point was your, to use a 1960s term, your political conscience raised?
Hmm. I mean, and that's also hard to put a finger on, because I mean, I have traced the narrative of my political consciousness on the issue that I work on, because I've had to speak about that quite a bit. But I think that more generally, it's hard to say. And as we're saying, these seeds are planted very early. And in my family, there's so many things to point to. I think that my grandparents, especially on my mother's side, were very politically conscious, were very progressive, and outspoken. Um, and my grandfather in particular, he was a writer who was blacklisted during McCarthyism. He did works through WPA, the Works Project Administration.
Explain what McCarthyism and work project WPA is, because they're different eras.
That's true. You're
Yeah.
right. So the WPA came first.
Mhm.
Uh, and this was a time when, as part of recovering from the Depression, the government created all of these projects that were sometimes, I mean, the people tell stories about it as sometimes being not actually useful in some ways. Like there's famous, jokes about people digging holes just to fill them back in again. But in many ways, it's where we got a lot of the institutions that didn't exist before, related to very important endeavors, certainly around the arts, that received government funding. And I don't know, I'm not as steeped in the history here beyond that too much, but I think that my grandfather was a beneficiary of some of these grants and some of the work that for artists in particular. And my understanding, is he had a play that was on a Broadway stage, through the WPA. But he also published in and had sympathies for uh, political communism and
The other Marx.
the other Marx. Yes, that's later in life we reunite in Marxism. But his was the bearded Marx, not the mustache. And my grandpa Irving Israel, this was a given name. He then later in life lost a lot of um, opportunities, as it's told, in projects that because he had published during that time, in that earlier time, he had published in communist periodicals, I guess you would call them.
Mhm.
Some, I think, short stories at that time, and then was on the list. So McCarthyism is so named for I feel like everyone knows at least a bit about McCarthyism if they don't know about the.
I have listeners in Nepal and Botswana, so
Okay,
yeah.
Botswana and all they may not know. But yes, this was at a time at the height of the Cold War scares that it became quite populist and easy to really hate on the other, and especially in the dynamic of the Cold War, attention was focused on anyone who might be sympathetic to Russia, and a particular senator, famously Joseph McCarthy, who famously terrorized uh, both the politics of the U.S. but also the culture of the U.S. by creating, I guess they were like governmental investigation programs to figure out who is sympathetic to Russia, and to basically excommunicate them from whatever whatever corner of society that they were in. And it affected many, many people. It was a real, a very famous scourge, and my grandfather was one of them.
And famously, there was a couple named Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were New Yorkers who were accused of spying or collaboration. It's a story and a trial too long to get into here, but it affected millions of people in terms of their understanding of themselves vis-a-vis their government.
Mm,
Their sons were orphaned when both of them were put to death. I knew those boys. They're a little older than I am. And this created a schism, I think, in the United States that lives to this day about fear of the other, about just whoever the other is. It certainly existed before with racism and slavery and anti-Semitism and all of that. But this was a new iteration because the other was also now Russia or communism.
yeah.
Russia during World War II was a brave ally of the United States. I'm not here to praise Joseph Stalin, but the Russian people fought very bravely alongside Britain, the United States, and other countries to try to end World War II. We're going to get to how the United States ended World War II a bit later. It's important. But what I want people to understand is that these roots and the contradictions and frankly the lack of knowledge among many people leads to certain kinds of hatreds and animosities of the other that does us a great deal of harm. We can see this in opera all the time, but thankfully then the curtain comes down and we walk out. But in real life, there are consequences, and certainly Ethel Rosenberg paid in a major way. She paid with her life. Her children lost their mother, and this becomes the subject of film and of operas and so on. Famously, Tony Kushner's Angels in America is a story about many things, but that's one of them as well. So getting back to you, you went to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, which is a beautiful spot. It's a very fine university. Many people went there. I have relatives who went there as well and moved to North Carolina because they liked it so much. And what did you study there? Because I have a sense that you were, probably an actor and you were catching coins with your elbow and doing all of that, but also discovering other things that push you in a new direction.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm extremely fortunate, one of these um, people who got to had this very classic liberal arts experience in a big U.S. university. I think that um, these opportunities are, especially if your audience is the whole world, it's important to know how much privilege is wrapped up in an experience like that. Um, and it was just quite an exceptional 4 years for me of discovery and very free, just a very free part of my life when I could just explore whatever I wanted. It was pretty magical. And yeah, I went there on a scholarship program that brought me down there. Otherwise, I don't think I would even occur to me to leave New York. Uh, in my grand introduction, you spoke about all the countries I've been to and lived in. But at that point, going into college, I had never been anywhere really, or much of anywhere. So it was like I always I've actually, it's more than you said. It's like, I think like around 70 countries that I've been to, but the most foreign experience I ever had was moving from New York to North Carolina. Uh, and it was just because it was my first time, like really changing cultures.
Yeah.
And, but that was part of it for me. That was just so fascinating. And I was so interested in life in that part of the world when I was there. And I was so interested in both the school and the extracurriculars. So I came and was doing a lot of Yeah, arts and music and theater and film. And I thought maybe that's what I was gonna study. But then I was also interested in, a lot of the social studies related disciplines, and ended up getting a degree. My degree was in international studies. Wait,
Hmm.
international, that's what they called it then. I think now they've changed the name. At that school, and which was itself an interdisciplinary program that where I had to take classes in and like find specific concentrations, and I was concentrating in economics, and you had to pick a couple languages and a couple of regions, and I ended up focusing on things relating to nuclear weapons, and that's where I was. That's where I was headed. I mean, that's not where my interest in nuclear weapons began. I
Yep.
that started, way earlier, uh back in Canarsie even.
Yeah.
Really became quite interested in the weapons themselves, but eventually in the politics around the weapons. Um,
So
and
I don't know the years you were at the University of North Carolina, but in 1982, in the summer, I believe, was an enormous protest in New York City, anti-nuclear weapons. It
yeah,
was at the time the largest protest of any kind, bigger than civil rights, bigger than women's rights, bigger than, when I say civil rights, I mean integration and African Americans getting equal rights. Um, but this was the biggest, and I took part in that, but there were
oh, you were
some.
there.
Oh, I didn't see you.
No, no, I
Were
was
you
not.
there?
You were there.
Okay.
Just
But
June 12th, 1982. Um,
yeah.
and I know that in part because we can talk about this, but we've done a lot of programs to commemorate the anniversary of it, and I was still that's way before I got to college. I
Hmm.
was 5 years old at that
In
time. So
1982, you were 5 years old?
yes,
Wow.
uh,
I was
so I
working at the Metropolitan Opera.
well, we might have crossed paths there. In fact, that's back when, I was probably able. Yeah, I was probably going more to the opera, but I didn't go to the protest,
Hmm.
and I had because I'm sure it would have had a massive imprint on my brain to be there. As you say, it was the largest single day, single issue protest, still we believe ever, I think,
Yeah.
and we this group that I have co-founded here in New York, it's called the New York Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. We have been part of several initiatives to commemorate that march, but also to tell the full story of New York's relationship to nuclear weapons, starting with the Manhattan Project, so named because, for a reason. It did
Yeah.
begin in Manhattan, New York, Manhattan. I mean, people
Hmm.
don't realize it, and that New York has this enormous legacy related to the Trinity test and related to the development of nuclear weapons. Uh, and uh, and there's communities that are still suffering in New York, and many wouldn't even realize it from the effects of the Manhattan Project and all of the uranium and oxide, thorium oxide that came through New York and was processed here. And there used to be nuclear missiles based in New York City. I mean, things that people today
Yeah.
have no idea about. And we've tried to tell this story in a few different ways. And we actually made a map that is one of the outputs that we've created that I encourage people to go check out because it's fun. It's like this designed as this great tourist map looking thing, but in fact, it's
Mhm.
telling the story of this legacy that's quite complicated because we have the story of how these weapons were originated in New York, but also there's a great legacy of New Yorkers leading the protests around and the rejection of nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
And Central Park is one. The Central Park protest in June 1982 is one landmark and one plot point on our map. But if you go to nuclearnyc.org, I believe it is, I can double check that. You can see our map. And others, and that will connect you to the many stories of what nuclear weapons have done to New Yorkers already, even before they've thankfully not been detonated in New York. But we continue to this day to support the nuclear weapons industry. Like New York, we believe invests around $500 million of public pension money in companies that build and maintain nuclear weapons. But we've also been part of getting some very, I think, impactful city council legislation passed that is also continuing the legacy of addressing and changing New York's legacy with nuclear weapons.
I'm going to ease us gently into the organization that you are a major part of that addresses the issue of nuclear weapons. But there's one little detour I want to take first, because it's something I'm asked all the time as someone who cares about this issue. Nowadays, we're looking at alternative means of energy so that we don't burn fossil fuels, and we are looking for wind energy, for so-called clean energy. There are people who are proponents of, even if they were against nuclear energy in the past, of revisiting nuclear energy, which is a thing apart, unless you think I'm wrong and you tell me, from nuclear weaponry. Because, people, they use the word nuke when they put something in the microwave. I think the word nuclear, there's nuclear family, the word gets used too much. And I would like for you as the expert to please make the distinction between nuclear weaponry, nuclear energy, and then tell me where you stand on the use of nuclear energy.
Okay. Thank you for easing us into the subject of nuclear, and I guess I was already started. I already got us down that path. And one reason I should say is because that I guess I just always these days, these past years, kind of this is something I'm asked to talk about quite a lot, nuclear weapons, that is. And so I just always venture more easily into that subject.
Well, I'll get you back to the arts. Don't worry.
Arts stuff, which I haven't been. But also, I think, when you asked me to join you, I thought to myself, I hope I don't I hope I'm not asked for expertise on opera, which I know is the main subject of your work, and it's not it's not something that I claim expertise in.
That's okay.
I do love opera, but yeah, but I'm also glad that we're going to talk about this before I get into the work of ICAN, because my organization, International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, we are neutral on this subject. We are a single issue organization. Our focus is on nuclear weapons. So before we get into that, I'll take off that hat and clarify that now I'm speaking from my personal perspective here, and not for ICAN in this regard when it comes to nuclear energy, because it's not something that we speak about really, or advocate around really. But the answer is that what we're talking about is different but related, incredibly related. When we talk about nuclear energy, we're talking about a process that's quite similar to the process for developing the fissile materials needed to build nuclear weapons. It's just a matter of how much you are enriching the core substance that's used in the process. So the uranium, which isotope is being enriched, and people talk about like weapons grade uranium. That's meaning that they've enriched it to the point that it's useful for the fission fusion detonation process that's required for nuclear weapons. But then you also could enrich uranium or some other radioactive substance to the point of being able to be part of the process for manufacturing nuclear energy. Now, when people who are proponents of nuclear energy talk about it. They talk about the incredible efficiency of the energy that creates from the fission process and possibly in the future a fusion process. And that's scientifically true. There's a massive amount of energy that can be produced from only a little bit of substance. But I think that, and there's probably some sinister reasons for this, we are often made to forget about the rest of the process, the part of the process that requires first mining the substances that are used, and all the way to the part of the process that relates to storing the spent energy that's used. And there are communities in the United States and around the world that are suffering so intensely and for so long, like multi-generational impacts. And mostly we're talking about indigenous communities or Black and brown communities, certainly, where their people have been part of the processes on the beginning or the end of that chain, and they're now unable to live normal lives for the level of cancer rates, the level of birth deformities and challenges that are stories that I can't tell nearly as well as they can, but I've always tried to learn more about and meet more of the people who are dealing with this, because it's so impactful, and they have these really horrifying experiences, and not enough people are hearing them. And then you learn about the fact that when we're talking about these reactors and these plants that we plan to build or that we already have built, and the rate of accidents and malfunctions that happen on in certain intervals, but build more, then presumably that the statistics go up that there will be more. But the other thing that's left out of the analysis is how long it takes to build some of these processes, how much money is required to build them, how much fossil fuels are used to get these plants up and running, and often to run them. And then again, on the back end, the fact that you can't really turn them off.
Yeah.
I mean, once you build one of these, we need to keep cooling the whatever we're processing for, tens of thousands of years possibly, or else we're really careening towards some massive environmental and or humanitarian harm. So I think that's just often left out of, all of that's left out of the discussion. But and not to mention that, when we talk about countries that have the capacity to create nuclear energy, we often call them like latent nuclear powers, in the sense that they turn a switch and they're ready to build weapons, uranium. So if we're concerned about the proliferation of nuclear energy as a weapon, it's also something that needs to be seriously taken into consideration. All that being said, and now I think soon we're going to put on my other hat, I'll also explain why and how this is not an issue we're advocating around.
I understand. I'm going to keep your hats off for a second because I want to say something. There was a film, and I wish I could remember the title. I don't think of it very often. That starred Susan Hayward, Brooklyn girl, by the way, and many other important actors. And what's particular about this film, which was filmed, I believe, in Nevada, not far from nuclear waste storage sites, is that everyone who starred in that film or played in the film died young of cancer.
Yes, including, is it the same film? Because this is the story also of, is it John Wayne, like a very famous Western actor who also...
John Wayne, he had a terrible cancer, may have been in that film too.
Well, it was either it's that film or another film, and I'm sorry, there's a new film actually that's coming out now that's telling the story that I've recently gotten wind of. But anyway, yes, that many people who have created in film and in movies who were filming out in those locations,
Hmm.
uh, all got many of them got cancers, and it's clearly connected. I
Yeah,
think is paying attention, and that's been advocated around for many years and also not heard because there's a huge industry that doesn't
sure.
action on
Now,
it. So,
there's just one more thing I want to mention before we get into ICAN, which is your organization. Um, my concern about nuclear power, in addition to everything you said, which I agree with, is that often these places are built on earthquake zones, like in Japan, um, in zones near rivers, like in India, in northern Italy, Chernobyl, which is in a war zone in Ukraine, 3 Mile Island, which is in a rather vulnerable, heavily populated part of the northeastern United States in Pennsylvania. And not that we should put them anywhere, but every time I hear about an earthquake in Japan, and I think of Fukushima, I'm pronouncing it wrong, but Fukushima, um, is that was March of about 11, 12 years ago. And I remember that the Metropolitan Opera was supposed to go on tour there, and it ultimately did go on tour there, but many people didn't go with the company. And I remember that friends of mine who were not originally scheduled to go were asked to go and fill in at the last minute. And I worried about them. I worried about the people of Japan, of course, but it's as if we don't seem to be paying full attention. We think of Japan as being a rigorous country with safety controls and so on. And yet they keep having these things happen in the nation, and this is where we're going to get to it, that is the most famous victim of the atom bomb.
yeah.
And you lived in Japan, and I would like to know what you think about the fact that the nation that was the victim of the atom bomb, which was dropped by the United States on August 6th and August 9th of 1945, um, why are they not more careful about things like building nuclear reactors on earthquake zones by the ocean where millions of fish are being polluted or killed, and the fish then swim to Washington, Oregon, California, Vancouver, Mexico? Why?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of angles I think to think about that, or lenses through which to think about that. First of all, why, as you say in the beginning, are all of so many of these places, so many of these plants built around in the where they're built? And it's, one reason or big reason is because they need to be near these massive water supplies. So, but the converse of that is that when there's an accident, and inevitably accidents occur, we're talking, the immediate pollution of of lands and seas, and that has devastating and long-term consequences. And in the case, and I think if we think about the risks and consequences of climate chaos, then we'll see decreasingly few opportunities to even think about places where some these kinds of reactors can be built so-called safely. Um, Now, again, I'm not wearing my ICAN hat in this point, but it is worth saying too that Japan has not only made, I think, some unfortunate decisions around nuclear energy, but also when it comes to nuclear weapons, this country that suffered these enormous consequences and ongoing harms from the U.S. bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is in a military alliance with the United States that has caused them to be not very progressive on the issue of nuclear disarmament, I'm sorry to say, so far. Now, I believe that this will change. I believe it's already changing. And when we talk about these countries, just as we were saying around the concept of McCarthyism and the idea of othering, there's no reason to, just when we say this, we're talking about the governments. We're talking about current governments that always change. And so it's worth saying that there's an enormous movement in Japan to change course on both of these issues, and either together or separately,
Mhm.
advocating against nuclear, but advocating against certainly for nuclear disarmament, which is, even when their policies don't align, Japan has considered themselves through multiple governments to be proponents of nuclear disarmament. It's just a matter of what it looks like in fact. And so, we believe that these things will change and are changing. Um, but when it comes to the dangers and harms of nuclear energy, these unfortunately these can't be corrected when they go wrong.
Mhm.
And right now, Japan is looking to dump the irradiated water from the Fukushima accident into the Pacific, and that's causing international incidents in terms of diplomacy. Because the reality is that when these things happen, that's all everyone needs to offload their irradiated materials. Where do they do it? But we don't even have to look that far. In New York, we have the now shuttered Indian Point nuclear power plant. That's also the company that's been operating that is also looking to dump the irradiated waste materials into the Hudson River. And in all of these times, when all of these things happen, you have all of this analysis that from the corporations or the governments that are advocating to do this, that are telling everyone that it's safe or that it's safe enough. And I think that we often find over time, especially, that this analysis is terribly biased and terribly dangerous. And but we need people to act before it becomes too late. I think what's true, certainly in the context of nuclear weapons, is that we're effectively, society that's not paying attention. It's kind of like we're those frogs in the boiling water.
Mhm.
The story, or the adage about the frog that doesn't notice that it's being boiled to death until it's too late. I mean, you can say that about climate chaos, certainly, and the slowness of for people to act and for governments to act on that. But I think it's also true when it comes certainly to nuclear weapons, that we've been lulled into a sense of complacency that's in large part because of these very well organized stories that are being, and ultimately lies that are being told to us around the consequences of these activities.
Now, I suppose my background is someone who writes cookbooks and is a good cook and so on. We in New York don't take much fish out of the Hudson for consumption, but Japan is one of the leading fish-eating nations in the world and has lived off the fish supply along its coast, in addition to trawlers that travel further afield. But much of the fish the Japanese consume is from that part of the Pacific. How come the people are not up in arms over the fact that this dumping from Fukushima is changing the fish? So, I mean, if the fish arrive in the Western United States already sick and with all kinds of disturbances on them, what could they possibly be like in Japan where the dumping is happening? And how
Yeah,
come people are not? I mean, next time I go to Japan, I've only been once. I'm very hesitant now to eat the fish. I
yeah,
really
understand.
am.
And to be fair, well, first of all, again, this is not an issue that I really work closely on, but I do know that it's not just the Japanese who are in civil society in Japan and others in Japan who are concerned about this, but the Pacific nations all over are voicing their concerns around this particular issue. And yeah, I think you're right to be concerned. At the same time, I think that we've also learned, and as we really explore the legacy of the nuclear industry and nuclear weapons testing, and we see that the whole world is quite already affected by what's been done at all. all levels of this chain. And it's hard to be anywhere without risking exposure. I mean, right now you're in Manhattan, right? And as I
Mhm.
was saying, there's a lot of nuclear materials that have passed through here and that cannot fully be remediated. I mean, we like to think that they can, but it's really quite impossible.
Yeah.
And we have these affected sites throughout New York City that people don't know about. I don't mean to scare any listeners, but you're talking about being afraid to eat the fish in Japan, but it's like there's we have Superfund sites in Queens where
Yep.
the Wolf Alport company was dumping radioactive materials into the sewers. And now, we don't know why there's a Superfund site there, but it's from the Manhattan Project. The
Hmm.
Highline
Yeah.
offices in Chelsea, the current site of where the Highline has its offices was adjacent to the Baker and Williams warehouses, where we stored tons of processed uranium, and uh, we've had remediation efforts, and the EPA says it's now safe. But I think,
Environmental Protection Agency.
all right,
Yeah.
right. But I think that one has to always. I think it's good to be skeptical of the standards
Yeah.
that a lot of people who are giving us this information use.
So ICAN, ICANW.org. I'm reading from the website. ICAN is the international campaign to stigmatize, prohibit, and eliminate nuclear weapons. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, is a coalition of non-governmental organizations promoting adherence to and implementation of the United Nations Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty. When was that treaty created? Who signed it? Who was against it?
So yeah, well, originated in 2007 and spent the first decade trying to blaze a path toward getting this treaty uh, into existence, and was really about reframing the debate around nuclear weapons away from one that was focused on state-based security, like which ultimately leads to the sort of rhetoric of nuclear weapons are bad when others have them, but good when I have them, and keep me safe, and that is really unsustainable as far as I think human existence goes as a theory, and to think instead around human-based security and what nuclear weapons what are the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And well, I'll skip a lot of steps, but after a series of conferences through 2013 and 2014, where governments got together to analyze the humanitarian consequences of any use of or testing of nuclear weapons, we were able to shepherd a process that led to, in 2017, the negotiation of what became the United Nations Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the Ban Treaty, as you just described it. So that treaty was negotiated throughout 2017 and was adopted on July 7th, 2017 by a vote of 122 countries in favor. So you asked who's in favor, who's against it. Well, the only people that voted on that day were the ones that were participating in negotiating the text of the treaty throughout 2017. So that fateful day in July, 122 countries voted in favor, one against. So an
Yes.
overwhelming vote in favor. But in the years subsequent, as we've now tried to promote the treaty, and it, legally to enter into force, it required 50 states to ratify it, to fully join it, that is, to ratify or accede to it and become what we call states parties to that treaty, or member states of the treaty. But it's like a multi-step process, or it can be. Countries can sign a treaty without that's something you do, but to sort of indicate your intent to join, or the process is moving along, but you're not fully states parties at that point. So there's different ways to look at the support, but in terms of the numbers, if that's helpful, I can break it down this way: that today, as we record, we have 97 states that have either signed it or fully acceded to it. So that includes 93 signatory states and 70 states that are full states parties at this point. It entered into force once 50 joined it fully, 50 ratified. So that happened in 2020, in October of 2020. So it became law in January 22nd of 2021. So it's been law since January 2021. That's when 50 states ratified it. Now 70 have ratified it, and a further 27 have signed it. Okay.
Inquiring minds want to know which was the one country that voted against.
That's the Netherlands.
Why?
Well, the ultimate reason is that the Netherlands was the sole representative, sole country that was there among NATO states, which generally tried to decided that they would boycott the entire process. They decided they were against it before they even saw what it was. And there's a lot of reasons for that too, but ultimately it relates to the nuclear alliance, or rather, the decision, the current decision among NATO states to declare itself as a nuclear alliance, even though that's nowhere in the infrastructure of NATO that it needs to be, and before the Clinton era, it wasn't. But anyway, that was the Netherlands standing in for NATO at that moment.
And it strikes me that the Netherlands is the seat of the World Court.
Yeah, that's true.
So if ever cases come up, it'll be tried in the Netherlands, which is interesting to me.
Well, I mean, it is something to be said that some of the states, I think that some of the states that are so nervous about the treaty, they know what it effective on. They're experts in international law. Some of them, they know what effect it will have in constraining the entire system that's based on nuclear deterrence. And so, I think that the Netherlands could be counted among them. But that being said, it's also worth noting that the Netherlands came to these negotiations, and they did so in large part because of the political process relating to like direct referendum in the Netherlands, where an overwhelming number of or percentage of the Dutch population was supportive of this treaty and insisted the government be there. And so it's in this way that we really see the power of civil society in some of these states, in most of these states, to really affect change. And I think that, helps us see how we're on a path to getting there, even things are not fully there yet. And I didn't even describe when I'm talking about the numbers, because that's, I think, where we're going kind of, I said, so there's 97 states that have signed it or fully ratified it. But there's an additional 40 states that have indicated that they're coming along, that they support the treaty, and they're process of signing or ratifying that, in what we call universalization of the treaty, we're moving toward getting them to sign or ratify too. But in the meantime, they have done things like make statements in favor of the treaty, or they've voted in favor of this annual resolution at the United Nations Assembly that declares support for the treaty. And so, but that's an additional 40 states. All told, we know that over 2/3 of the world's countries support this treaty. And I think that's encouraging in terms of envisioning the future of this multilateral process, especially in a world where basically every other multilateral process is moving in the wrong direction. So we've seen now 2 meetings of states parties. So that's like when the member states come together to work on implementing the treaty. The second meeting of states parties just happened this past December 2023. So, this is like the early stages of this treaty, but it's already moving pretty fast as these things go.
On your website on ICANW.org, there's a very handy device to check countries all around the world and see where they stand on this issue and who supports it, who is friendly to it, who is not friendly to it, who opposes it. Yes. And you list 9 nations that possess nuclear warheads. I'm going to read them. Russia, 5,889. USA 5,224, so a tie. China 410, France 290, the United Kingdom 225, Pakistan 170, India 164, so that's a tie. Israel 90, and North Korea 30. And then there are countries that, if I understand correctly, store them for these other countries. Am I putting that correctly?
Well, we say host, but
Host them.
I
Like
think often
Italy, for example, which
like Italy. Yeah,
horrified me. Yeah,
I think the euphemism of host or store is really quite deceptive. I mean, these are
yeah,
countries where these weapons are based and ready for launch
yeah.
from countries in generally speaking under the command of nationals of those countries. You know,
Hmm.
I mean, we could say that they're U.S. weapons technically in the case of the NATO states that host, or Russian weapons in the case of Belarus. But ultimately, I think that it's a little bit weaselly, sometimes we say, or
Hmm.
devious for these states to sort of consider themselves non-nuclear weapon states, as
Hmm.
they do under the prevailing structure of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. But yeah, there's basically it's Netherlands, Italy, as you say, Germany, Belgium, Turkey, and now Belarus that hosts nuclear weapons
I
for.
think.
Yeah.
um, it is a great achievement that you and your colleagues have done. And a question that I've been holding for you, not based on today, but just as your friend, for a long time, is the following. When you Often I'll get in touch with you and where are you? And you'll tell me where you are in the world. And it sounds very glamorous, of course, but I know that what you're actually doing is attempting to persuade another country to join the cause. How, what argument do you make? How do you do this to bring a nation? And I know politics are different and regionalism is different. So, say Paraguay, which is the middle of South America and landlocked, would be a very different issue from Greece, which is in hot territory. But how would you go? What's your approach? How do you make the case? And tell me anything else you want about how this happens.
Yeah, no, I think that's, as you say, that the answer to that question really depends on who you're talking to. Um, and uh, and around the world in different regions, you see very different perspectives on nuclear weapons. From on one end of the spectrum, uh, the nuclear armed states, as we, those nine states that you mentioned first, the U.S., China, Russia, France, the UK, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea. These are states that have truly invested in this theory, and it's certainly
Hmm.
that's the theory that nuclear weapons provide them with security. These are states that were, in different ways, be it through negotiation from our states' parties and from civil society to the extent that's possible, they need to be disavowed of that notion that nuclear weapons provide a security function in peacetime or any military advantage in wartime, because these
Hmm.
are not weapons that provide military advantage. They are weapons that are basically exist to terrorize civilian populations and ultimately to kill civilians. So that's one range of work that's being done, and wherever we can and wherever our partners can, we're doing that work there. Now, there are those who, in a second category, let's say, who realize that nuclear weapons are more dangerous than secure, who realize that they create more instability than stability, but who think that until others give them up, they need to have them, or they need to be in an alliance with someone who has them. This notion that they're good for us and bad when others have them. And
Hmm.
I think that that category of rationale, the work that's being done there too, also, and this is also like doing through public advocacy and negotiation with governments, to convince them of the improbability of the status quo
Mhm.
continuing, even if they wake up tomorrow and the next day and everything seems fine to them, that this is not a sustainable path, and that it's exactly those states that need to take action now where there remains some kind of political asymmetry in their perspective, that this is the time to act. It's the time, it's when you have this advantage, if you believe you have it, that you need to work before, before those rogue states in their mind do, in fact, build their something that creates some sort of parity in that way, or if that's the way you think. And because even if the other related argument you need to really advance with that kind of that kind of rubric of thinking is that if you look at the number of near global annihilation incidents that have happened because of accident, miscalculation, this is, even if your whole theory is based on rational thought from your adversaries, if since we're sitting in the US and we're thinking a lot about Russia, let's say, or if you're sitting here, for listeners sitting in Europe thinking a lot about Russia these days, I mean, your entire security system is based on your faith that Vladimir Putin will behave rationally every day, just so you know. I mean, that's
Mhm.
that's what nuclear deterrence is. It's that he will wake up every day and 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 believe and function a certain way. One person will function a certain way based on your entire security philosophy. Um, so that's the work that's being done with those
Mhm.
states. Uh, then there's a huge category of people who are totally on board that abolition and elimination is the answer, but there still need to be convinced around this treaty. Maybe, there's obviously, it's a new treaty. There's a lot of discussion that's still happening. And sometimes they need to hear more from their own civil society on the treaty. So this is the category of work we're doing to discuss what the issues are with them and for them, and help. Maybe sometimes it's a matter of capacity. Sometimes these are smaller states that were this treaty that we're working on is at the bottom of a pile of treaties that or other instruments that they work on. So it's just a matter of working with them to do what ultimately they want to do. Um, and the best states, the gold star states, let's say, those non-nuclear weapon states that are already totally on board with this treaty, they know, they're the ones that I think see most clearly on this issue that it is incredibly unrealistic, and in fact it's inevitably
Mhm.
impossible for deterrence to preserve security, and they see the treaty that we're working on as the only pathway towards stability and future for that's safe for the next generations.
Now, I think you'll understand this question. You're smart, so you understand everything, but you will understand the spirit of this question. I met you in June of 2016. You and ICAN won the Nobel Peace Prize like a year and a half later. You were playing Harpo Marx in a little theater in the New York Fringe Festival. Um, how how did your life work that you were simultaneously doing high comedy brilliantly well? And in this particular case, what struck me about your performance was that you were playing Harpo, who doesn't speak, who plays lots of musical instruments, who expresses himself in other ways. Um, Yet you are eloquent, although I would guess it's just instinct that you don't necessarily love to talk in public, but you are very good at it because you're impassioned. Um, because you were playing a silent character, you were not, quote, reading lines, but you were playing scenes in action and so on. Um, how does it work that a man could do both? I'm not saying that people don't gather multitudes. Walt Whitman was from Brooklyn, by the way, too. But it's unusual to be Harpo Marx and an campaigner and activist against nuclear weapons.
I'll give you that. I mean, the last statement I can agree with that. Um, you know, it is something that um, that I think some people, or other people at least, seem to struggle to see how these ideas and interests connect. But I think that um, I guess that I see, and the Harpo experience, by the way, through which we met, that of course that was just one element of. You're right, that was a very specific one, and that show went on to this, since you saw it, went on to this very, I'm very proud to say, this very successful off-Broadway run that was was very meaningful to a lot of people, I think, and because it was the first ever revival of the Marx Brothers' first ever Broadway show, and it was exciting to see success. And for Noah Diamond, the creator of it, it was just, I think,
Who played Groucho?
like Groucho, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll say that Harpo, I like to push back on Harpo being a silent comedian because he sure makes a lot of noise, but you're right that he doesn't speak.
Well, his memoir was Harpo Speaks.
That's true. That's but I think, to me, the common denominator for art, my life in the arts and my life in law and advocacy, is just a lot of interest in exploring truths,
Mm-hmm.
really digging and finding what's true, whether it's about like a person or a country of people, or even a fictional character, in the case of theater, and to sort of explore how to make things better and fight for and advocate for that truth that either your character has or that I have in my life. But I think I have thought this through on some level in the past too, that that art and advocacy are connected in the sense that or at least the work that I'm doing is like I get a lot of pleasure from well, all kinds of artistic work that I've done, but I really am particularly drawn to absurdism, and I see Harpo and the Marx Brothers as living in a world of absurdism that at the time was not artistically defined. This is before like the Ionesco kind of like concept was, I mean, they didn't see it this way. Let's just put it, let me be straight about that, because I think anytime you start getting too philosophical about the Marx Brothers, you run into the trap of defining them in a way they would never define themselves. They just wanted to be fun and, screw the rest of it. But of course, today we do recognize that they had this very strong sort of sense of anti-authority and absurdity, especially in Harpo, that I'm really drawn to. I mean, I think that life in many ways is ultimately chaos, and finding the silliness of it is very it's of course very satisfying. And doing Harpo in particular, it was almost like putting on a superhero cape of id, like you had a superpower of basically following impulse in many ways. I mean, there were many rules and many constrictions to how you looked and how you behaved because you were inhabiting a real actor, a real person. But otherwise you had license to do anything in a special way. And I always think about the fact that like life is story driven, and it's more story driven than science driven. And for many people's experiences, obviously there's some science that again that you have to live in the rules of. We can't change gravity, but apart from that, we're living the lives that we define. And so when I try to connect the dots here, it's to me, it's interesting to do the work I do in law and in advocacy, because to me, it's what we're all trying to build towards is some sort of order that that preserves humanity, right? That's what law is, really. That's what we strive for, so that we can all wake up in a predictable scenario in the midst of all this chaos. But why? Why do we care? What's the big deal if we all die tomorrow, or we won't know, right? I mean, who cares? And to me, that's the other side of my pursuits. The why is art and silliness and love. I mean, these are the things that why we care, and it's important to me to be able to tap into that, not just by consuming art, which is, I suppose, the way, which is one fair way of doing it, but also by creating it.
You and I have gone to two musical performances together. We went to your John Andrea Nozeda lead the National Symphony Orchestra at Carnegie Hall in April of 2023. And a few months earlier, I took you to the Metropolitan Opera House to see Verdi's Aida. Now, Aida's a classic, and it had a great cast: Michelle Bradley, Anita Rockfeller-Shvili, Brian Jade, Quinn Kelsey, Paolo Carignani conducted, Christian Van Horn was in it. And so great cast, famous production. I could have taken you to anything, but I took you to Aida. And it starts with someone who wants to be a warrior, Se quel guerriero io fossi. And then in the second act, the Egyptians cry, guerra, 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 war, war, war. Act 3, we begin to see the consequences of war. And Act 4 is when Aida and Radames, who is the Egyptian, quote, warrior, are put to death. They're entombed and they run out of air. And above them is Amneris, who is the Egyptian princess who wanted to marry Radames, the warrior, who wanted basically to rule Egypt. She wanted what she wanted. When this opera was intended for opening the Suez Canal in Cairo in 1869, Verdi did not go to Egypt, but it was then presented it ultimately was done in 1871. It was then presented at La Scala in 1872, and Verdi added something at the very end. Amneris, who has the last lines of the opera, says 8 times, if I recall, but at least 8, pace, peace, pace, pace imploro, I'm asking for peace, pace, pace, pace. And it was the genius, the magnificent Verdi's way of taking a subject which was about the glories of war. And when I worked in Egypt and I would ask people if they knew Aida and what's it about, they would always say, it's about the power and glory of the Egyptian army. And they all said that same phrase, the power and glory of the Egyptian army, was their interpretation of what that opera was. And I would say to them, well, Verdi ultimately made it a call for peace. And I intentionally didn't talk to you about it that night because I didn't feel like being Mr. Opera. And I didn't want you to be Mr. Anti-War, and we would just be friends. But I've thought about it so many times since that these works speak to that, and the other great work that many operas do. But Wagner's Ring Cycle. I don't know if you've ever attended a complete Ring Cycle. Have you?
I have not attended a complete Ring Cycle, no.
Okay, so you and I, we're going to take a week and go somewhere and attend a Ring Cycle. I've attended 48 complete cycles, and I teach it all over the world.
Wow,
And among the many things that I'll talk to you about with this is the fact that Wotan, the chief god, and his wife Fricka, but not only his daughter, not her daughter, but his daughter Brunhilde, have great discussions at Wagnerian length about the importance of law. And Fricka, the wife, says laws are meant to be upheld and respected. Wotan feels constrained by having to do that. He carries a spear that has all the laws written on the spear. And ultimately the spear is broken. Brunhilde, his brilliant rebel daughter, is the one who acts out his will, but he has to punish her, even though he knows she's doing the right thing. And ultimately, many hours later in the fourth opera of the cycle, Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the gods being not the human race. There's not one god. There's a whole bunch of gods, and they're flawed, and they're as human as we are. But ultimately, Brunhilde makes many sacrifices for the good of the world. And I won't tell you how it ends. You'll have to come with me. But she makes the ultimate sacrifice, putting what is the existing law aside and opting for love over power. But in the act of opting for love over power, the world has to be destroyed and resurrected. And I love Groucho Marx, and I love Harpo Marx, and I love all the Marx brothers, but we got to go the opera route, my friend.
Well, it's always, first of all, it's humbling to always know how many times the stories you think are original have been told again and better. It's also, quite a privilege to well, to live in the aura of your expertise, Fred, and to know that, I have you in my life to teach me some of these things. I've always
That's not what I was fishing for,
I
but
understand,
I mean
I
it
know,
sincerely.
but I also have always, before I became interested in opera, my father worked with operas, both at the Conservatory of Music and, and he conducted a few, and he always tried to get me interested. It wasn't actually before I spent years living, by the way, in Riga, Latvia, which is kind of like the opera headquarters of the old Soviet times and continues
And
to.
it's where Wagner got his early training as an orchestral conductor.
Was gonna say, yeah. So I mean,
Hmm.
and they actually had when I lived there a ring cycle that I did not fully experience,
Hmm.
but I wish I had. So I might have known some of this a little better had I made it, but I'll be very lucky um to experience it with you. And I mean, I did see uh a lot of opera there, and I brought my when my parents would come visit me, that was their favorite thing to do. It's, by the way, if anyone is in that region or going there, that's one of the most extraordinary
It's a
places.
great opera house, and that little country has produced wonderful singers and conductors.
Yes, exactly. It continues
Andres
to.
Nelson, Christian Opalais,
Yeah.
Elena Garancha, Violetta Urmana, and that's just the top of the heap. There are many, many more.
Yes, exactly. And yet,
Um,
I would say that seeing Aida with you at the Met, and maybe this harkens to some of your other expertise. I think about like taking one of your guided journeys through Italy or something, and kind of cultures and experiences that who knows how long we'll continue to have. I mean, to know that the Aida will no will has a it may not be playing in the future.
well,
Or
that production is actually being retired, and the Met is bringing in a new production next
that's
season.
Oh, it's going to be a new production, but not of Aida. You mean a new production
The
of her?
opera, no, it's a new staging of Aida with
It is okay.
a
Okay.
new
That's good.
vision of the opera. And, we like new productions when they're good and they're well thought about. So
Yeah.
I love the old production. It's documented on video. It lasted 30 years. So it's okay, though I will miss it. But it's
Well, I'm
good to have
I'm
new
just
productions.
I was going to say that knowing that would not I wouldn't have that opportunity again. I'm incredibly
Yeah.
grateful. I
Um,
did. It was one of the most extraordinary experiences I've ever had. Full stop.
Thank you. Just two more comments, and then we must conclude, at least for now. One is that the other driving concept of Wagner's Ring Cycle, among many, there are hundreds, is the sense of destruction of the environment and the pollution of the waters and of the lands. And it wasn't that in the past they were produced that way often, but now Francesca Zambello, many great directors are producing, let's call them green rings or environmental rings, or rings that talk openly about how we, as the human race, are destroying our planet.
Mhm.
And Wagner understood that. Shaw, when he interpreted Wagner, he blamed it on capitalism. I'm not saying Wagner did that, but nonetheless, it's a very important theme and something that I know you will connect with for all the obvious reasons. Where I want to conclude is something else. I'm a big believer, as I think you can understand, in documentation, in discussion, in creating the kinds of conversations that you and I are having today, so that people can go back and we, in effect, are bearing witness for all kinds of things. And the last generation of survivors of the Holocaust are largely gone, and that's much discussed and important. But also, the last generation of survivors of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are almost gone. Um, I had a wonderful relative who was a surgeon, a plastic surgeon, but not to give you a prettier nose, but fixing people who were burned and damaged. And he went to Japan right after the bombing and operated on hundreds of mostly young women. I think they're called hibakusha is the word.
Yep.
Um, my cousin called them Hiroshima maidens. And
Yep.
when he died, hundreds and hundreds of women in their 70s and 80s came from Japan for his funeral. And
Mm.
I remember that they brought peace cranes, as they were called, these paper cranes. When I was a little kid, I went to a summer camp where we studied this and Japanese mourning rituals, Mourning. And on the 6th of August every summer at summer camp, we would go down to the lake and launch 1,000 cranes, paper cranes, into the lake as a gesture and as a reminder. This was only 20 years after the bomb. This
Hmm.
was the mid 1960s.
Hmm.
Um, so documentation is important, but also what survives. And in reading up on the ceremony, the concert that was held when you and your committee were awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace, there was a concert on December 14th, 2017, in which Hibaku pianos, Hibaku, that had been destroyed or largely damaged were successfully restored in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and brought to Oslo, where John Legend, the famous musician, performed on one or more of them. And this, too, this musical documentation, when we no longer have, unfortunately, the survivors of the Holocaust and of the bombings in Japan, we have this, we have the music. And, it's the old expression, life is short, art is long.
Yep.
But I believe in that very profoundly. And I'm saying this not to get your opinion, but to thank you. Because we don't hang out much because you're a busy man, but I so respect what you do and admire it and connect to it in my way. And it's not easy. I will never understand how a man could be Harpo and also help save the world, but maybe Harpo is the one to do it.
One hopes. I mean, I feel you wrapping up, but I also,
Yeah, I am.
you make me want to say so many things, and that
Go ahead.
beautiful
Go right
statement,
ahead.
connects, I believe, to what I was trying to articulate around our lives being guided by the stories that we tell, and the story that you're referring to about the Hiroshima maidens, and that I think was documented by Norman Cousins and others around their trip to the U.S. and the work done based out of, I believe, Mount Sinai Hospital too.
Exactly. That was my cousin.
So, that's a story that
Let's give him a name. His name was Dr. Bernard Simon.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Hmm.
No, I think, like, as you say, these fewer and fewer people are living who have these stories to tell. You have great institutions such as the Hiroshima Peace Museum that looks to preserve and share and continue to tell the stories um, of both the atrocity, but also the work being done to reverse the legacy of atomic weapons and nuclear weapons. And I think that it's, we hope that there will be no further uses of nuclear weapons in conflict where people have
Hmm.
to tell those stories. It should not be forgotten, by the way, though, that we often talk about nuclear weapons as if they were only used twice, but in
Yeah.
fact, weapons have been detonated over 2,000 times.
Mhm.
And for the people who have been destroyed and the lands that have been destroyed by those so-called tests of nuclear weapons, I don't know why to them it wasn't a test. It was the same effect, of course, as
Yeah.
weapons in conflict. And those there's a couple more decades of that usage, and from which we have survivors. Um, last week, I was working in these commemoration projects for the 70th anniversary of the Castle Bravo so-called test, where the U.S. detonated the largest nuclear weapon it's ever detonated, 1,000 times more powerful than what was detonated what the U.S. dropped in Hiroshima, and when it dropped on the Marshall Islands. So now
Hmm.
the communities of the Marshall Islands who were destroyed, displaced, and for generations have continued to suffer great harms, and and have some of the highest cancer rates in the world, and that obviously connected to and continue to suffer, and those people are still around to tell those stories, thankfully. Um, but I think that the cycle of humanity and the cycle of history, if we had a real historian among us, would be telling us, that history repeats itself
Hmm.
in so many ways, and that the only thing that could perhaps break that cycle is the ability to keep stories more clear and at the forefront of our policy, because this is when we lose those stories and when we forget, then we end up repeating, I think. and
Hmm.
and and so that's something that I think about quite a lot, and another reason why I think, as you say, it's art is so important, and uh, like even if people like me and everyone needs to invest in uh, the teachers we have from generations ago who told these stories so well,
Hmm.
and have so many important lessons to share. I mean, it's funny to hear you talk about people misinterpreting Aida, of course, or
Yeah.
perhaps not seeing the full story, because then perhaps it's that story isn't told enough or told the right way sometimes, and people don't get it. I mean, I got it
Hmm.
from watching it, so I guess there was a really good production.
Yeah, it was.
But I mean, I hear you. I think it's all about art. It's all about storytelling. I think we're living in a year right now, this year, where the movie Oppenheimer has just won
Oh, I
the
haven't heard about it.
yeah,
I would
maybe.
have asked you.
Well, we don't have to talk about it, of course,
No,
but
no, I figure you're
it's
asked that all the time. That's why I sidestep the film, which
that's
I
okay.
encourage people to see. But I'm here for you, not for Oppenheimer right now. So,
Good. Thank you.
yeah. So, Seth Sheldon, I must say goodbye for the moment because I'm going to an opera tonight.
Oh,
But I do thank you, and really, and I mean this, keep up the good work.
thank you. You too, Fred. It's always a delight to talk to you, and I'll do it anytime.
Thanks.